that after completion of all the three presentations, we'll have specific time for discussion. Now, may I take this opportunity to invite Professor Michimi
Yes.
to speak on? Please.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It is my honor to be able to speak before the distinguished guest. In wars, states fight not only with swords and guns, but also with speeches. This is especially so because not only democracies, but also non-democracies need support from its own people and support from the people of other countries. But there are many actors involved. They are not necessarily states. How to cut time is very often debatable. The victims are not necessarily visible, especially in the case of war. Production of false information for false flag operation is possible and very often tempting. Passions in war often hinders rational observation and calculation. Thus, wartime storytelling is in itself a kind of independent variable. This is a debate without limitation of time. Each state looks for a narrative which legitimizes its action and illegitimizes the actions of its opponents. Attackers explain how defensive they are, and victims and their supporters explain how the attack was unprovoked and cruel. The narratives may contain a lot of false information, but they also contain some truths, and regardless of the credibility of the narratives, they indicate from what angles they want its own people and other peoples of the world to see the situation. Paying attention to the opponent's narrative is unusual, useful, or even essential to understanding the situation more comprehensively, and the process does not necessarily mean allegiance or acceptance. But we have also be aware of the possibility that when two actors are debating, perhaps neither of them is telling the whole truth. In wars, there are particular characteristics and common characteristics. When we discuss narratives on wars, we usually face 1. Which of the aggressor and which is the aggressor and which is the defender? Usually, the aggressor argues that in order to achieve sustainable peace in the future, fighting is inevitable now as a necessary evil. Or an aggressor states that it is not aggressor, but it is being threatened. The defender and the supporters look at the present and stress the fact that the victim does not particularly provoke. 2. What are the relevant actors involved in the war? The victim usually does not say that the actors that support it provokes the aggressor. 3. When was the origin of the conflict and when did it unfold? How did it unfold? While the victim side tends to say that the aggression came out of the blue, for the aggressor, the defensive aggression was chosen after a long period of trying to put up with the suppressive manner with which it is treated. 4. What is the norm, or what is the real norm to be considered? The victim side will say that the victim's sovereignty is violated, where a state is equally sovereign. The aggressive side will say that all powerful states have a natural right to the sphere of influence, just like the US is in the Monroe Doctrine and in NATO. 5. what is to be done and what is not to be done. But this may not be said immediately after the start of war, or as each time does think how to end the war with some compromise. Let us start with Biden's speech soon after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. 1. Biden starts with the fact that Russia assaulted the people of Ukraine. War is described as an aggressor versus assaulted people, not necessarily assaulted state. It is described as a giant fighting vulnerable humans. Biden does not mention the US has been helping to train Ukrainian forces in the recent past. There is no question that the US was willing to tighten military relations with Ukraine, especially since the mid-2010s, when Crimea was taken by Russia and the fighting in Donbass were escalated. 2. What was happening, how long before the assault is skipped. 3. Biden says that this was an premeditated attack, which Putin had planned for months. On the point that this attack was planned months in advance, Russia will not act, but it is contestable if Biden focused on the individual leader. Putin is the current correct way to focus. For the US, the actors are not described as Ukraine and Russian, but as Ukrainian people and Putin. The US wants to describe the war as based on a strange decision by a strange individual leader, Putin, and not as a policy required by the state of Russia. 4. The above point corresponds to the fact that Biden describes Putin as a dictator. This may actually be not far from the truth, but the set of presentation of Ukrainian and Putin would be the listener's guess of which is a good guy and which is a bad guy. This cowboy narrative is apparent already in the first sentence Biden uttered. 5. Biden admits that there was some talk between Russia and the US before the war, but he says that the Russian side did not give a good answer. 6. Biden says that Russia perpetrated cyber attacks against Ukraine. It is possible that something that happened is not mentioned by neither side, US or Russia. 7. Russian attack on Ukraine is violating international law and Ukraine's sovereignty, but Biden explains the norm of international relations per se, not how the norm is actually maintained or compromised. For Putin, such actions as an attack on Libya or NATO attack on Serbia, US-UK attack on Iraq are also violation of international law. 8. Biden focuses Putin. Biden does not particularly name Russia as an aggressor. As for Putin, Putin does not name Biden as culpable, but Putin names the US as responsible for the subsequent developments in Ukraine. For Putin, Russian attack is reaction to the US and NATO, and well, as reaction to the policy of Ukraine. 9. Biden's explanations on the background is scarce. Accusing Putin, he jumps to the matter of economic sanctions against Russia. It was clear that the talk between the US and Russia before the start of the war is about the expansion of NATO, but Biden does not mention NATO in this context. The US is clearly aware of the point that it does not want to be touched. And Biden mentions that the US is sanctioning with the coalition of other states. In a sense, the US does not even try to persuade its friends and allies to agree with the US. The US wants other states to see cooperation with the US in this matter as a self-evident choice. This point seems missing in Putin's speech. The Russian side does not mention how large a group of other states are opposing Russian aggression of Ukraine. Biden says that the US already saw effects such as the decline of the Russian currency. 11. Biden says nothing about the relations between Ukraine and Russia in the preceding period. He does not even mention the situation in Crimea and Donbas, southeast Ukraine in the mid-2010s. Biden says that NATO will convene its summit. Biden says he sends additional forces to Germany and Poland. It seems as if he is showing the posture that the US is more ready to protect NATO members than Ukraine. 13. Biden does not mention how global power balance can change as a result of the war in Ukraine and sanctions against Russia. Biden is not seeing the global situation, including China and the Middle East. He is simply looking at Europe and Russia. 14. Biden links the aggression the aggression to violation of freedom. He says America stands up bullies. We stand up for freedom. This is who we are. This is a stage, this is a bit strange. Obviously, Russian side does not say this is a matter of freedom. Probably Cold War concepts began to wake up in America. 15. There are points which are many people wanted to ask, but Biden was quiet. Biden should have explained as to A, why, while transferring weapons to Ukraine, the US does not fight against Russia. B, is this not the beginning of a proxy war? C, if Ukraine capitulates or compromises, will the US object? D, why, assisting Ukraine, does the US not include Ukraine as a NATO member? F, what did NATO intend to do in the preceding periods towards Ukraine? Probably Biden owes a lot to the image of the Cold War USSR and the image of a dictator. Now, Putin's first speech after the beginning of the aggression on Ukraine. He discusses the recent histories of the expansion of NATO. How does he explain how the expansion was a violation of previous agreement with Russia? His point is that Russia expressed his opposition to the expansion of NATO, but the US and the existing NATO moved against the understanding. How the expansion of NATO infrastructure is being done in Ukraine. Putin seems to explain that not only the joining of Ukraine to NATO, but also cooperation between NATO and Ukraine war was threatening Russian national security. 2. Discussion of the way the US used the forces illegally in the world after the end of the Cold War, like NATO involvement in Kosovo, Libya, or war in Iraq. 3. In a sense, Putin challenges the post-Cold War world order led by the US, while admitting the power of the US is a system builder. Putin seems to be aware of the unfairness existing between the US and Russia. 4. Putin says that he cannot permit the development of modern missiles so near to the center of Russia. 5. Putin sees 2014 as a kind of coup under the influence of the United States. 6. Putin expresses his displeasure with a joint military maneuver of NATO with Ukraine. 7. Putin draws a lesson from World War II, including geographical proximity of Russia with a power center like Germany or Europe. B. What he calls neo-Nazism. 8. Putin mentions increasing domination of Ukraine during the past 30 years to the extent that it can be explained as colonialism with US money and US orders. 9. Putin discusses the relations between Russian state and the Ukrainian state, especially their mutual geographical relations. He admits, to some extent, that the Ukrainian nation exists, speaking similar but distinguishable language. But on the other hand, Putin thinks that the current boundary of the Ukrainian state is not a legitimate boundary, especially compared with the history of the Ottoman Empire. In other words, Putin seems to dispute not only Ukrainian nation, but also Ukrainian state. First, he is not pleased with the fact that Ukraine is too nationalistic in his view, even extremist, to the extent of discussing what is existing in Ukraine nation traditionally, such as Russian language. While admitting the distinction between Ukraine as a nation and Russia as a nation, or the distinction between Ukraine as a nation and Russia as a community of many ethnic and linguistic groups, Putin insists that the current boundary of Ukraine is too extended given the history Russia took the territory from
here.
10. Putin asked the Ukrainian soldiers not to fight. 11. Putin blames Ukrainian parties as very corrupt. 12. Putin mentioned that the third party should not intervene, indicating that Russia is a nuclear power. This may be a very soft threat on the part of Russia that participation into the war of a holder of nuclear weapons is very dangerous and therefore should be refrained. 13. Putin does not mention how other states are likely to impact the course of war. In sum, there is a big difference between the ways the war is narrated. 1. Biden and Putin seems to agree. What is happening is war. It takes time to end. The US and Russia are very serious. Ukraine is tasting a lot of pain. Biden stresses the present and the future. This is not the way to persuade or convince the Russians. Putin stresses the point, the past and the present, justifying the war, and without mentioning the cost of war paid by the Russians and the Ukrainians. 4. None of the two mentions the global impact of the war. 5. Biden's explanation is extremely simple, and its future orientation, he may be trying to hide the context preceding the next Russian attack. I wonder Biden was willing to explain that what Putin expresses as Russian fear is not a legitimate one. 6. Putin seems to be doing some exaggeration, such as identification of extremism and nationalism with Nazism. 7. Putin does not mention that freedom of speech is increasingly even more lost in the Russian political context. 8. Finally, as for Zelensky, as seen in his speeches, He describes the current human miseries in the war-torn Ukraine and asks for assistance. It is likely that he is accepted widely in American-centered media. Note on the impact on Taiwan. The U.S. showed very eagerly and at the early stage that the U.S. would not regard the attack on Ukraine, a non-NATO member, as an attack on the U.S., which means that the U.S. will not fight the Russians for Ukraine. It is proven that the land border, Poland-Ukraine border, is essential to transfer weapons and send advisors to Ukraine. This condition is missing in Taiwan. In the end, whether Russia intended or not, Russia helped China a lot and gave it a breathing time in the Chinese-American trade and technology war. Also, Russia could assume before the start of the operation that even if Russia and Europe imposed heavy sanctions against Russia, Russia is not isolated so long as Russian-Chinese relations exist. The US, if it forced Russia to do this direction of attack on Ukraine, the US also helps China. This abrupt change in the US-China relations can be comparable to September 11. The US lost more than 10 years in Iraq and Afghanistan when it needed to focus more on China and North Korea. 4. What is missing in the present Western discourses? Who is profiting from the war? China and pro-Russian states like North Korea and Myanmar. Should the US thank China for not helping Russia? How much time will the US lose while repairing Russia from Ukraine? Thank you very much.